Everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Anne-Sophie Corbeau, and I am a global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia SIPA. Today, we are going to discuss methane emission regulation and US-EU natural gas trade, or LNG trade. Let me first say that this event is being a webcast live, and the full video recording is going to be available online in the coming days. You can submit a question at any time using the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, I should also say that our events are closed captioned, so you can turn the captions on by clicking the live transcript button, which is at the bottom of your screen, and then select Show Subtitle. I am joined today by two of my colleagues, Tim Boersma and Dr. Robert Kleinberg. Our initial idea when we were discussing this webinar was to give an update about the US and EU regulations on methane emissions, because a lot has happened just before the end of the year in 2023. However, as you might all know, something has happened about a month ago. The US government decided on a pause on LNG permit approval for non-FTA countries in January 2024, and we have consequently decided to update a little bit the scope of our discussion. So what I am going to do, along with my colleagues Bob and Tim, is to guide you through our recent thinking on these issues. I will concentrate on the global LNG trade aspect. My colleague Tim is going to focus on EU regulation, while Bob is going to dig into the US regulation, but also present the comparison between US LNG and coal. So let me first start by sharing my screen. It should be better if I can. Sorry for that. So, US LNG is already the largest in the world. In 2023, the United States exported about 117 billion cubic meters of LNG. This is 21% of global LNG trade. That's quite important because also based on everything which is currently under construction, which is quite a lot. It's about 300 billion cubic meters of LNG export capacity, which is under construction. We can also say that the US is very likely to remain the largest LNG exporter, potentially forever, and even taking into account the latest announcement about Qatar expanding its capacity to about 193 billion cubic meters by 2030. If you are looking at where we should be by 2030, you can see that the US is going to represent roughly a quarter of global LNG export capacity and stay ahead of Qatar by about 40 billion cubic meters. And actually, if we are considering the fact that some of the capacity in other regions may be operated below capacity, we can say that the US is very likely to export more than 25% of global LNG. But of course, there has been this pause on LNG permit approvals, which was decided about a month ago. There are so many LNG projects which are planned in the United States that if we were considering even a selection of them, the US could very easily export actually twice more than that quantity that I'm showing you for 2030. In a recent blog that we wrote together with my colleague Ira and Akos, we looked only at a selection of projects which are commercially advanced, and these projects will represent about 77 billion cubic meters. But the point is, whether these projects move ahead or not, the United States is going to be a leader in terms of global LNG exports and is very likely to be reaching absolutely every single region in the world and is going to be overwhelmingly represented in terms of size. So therefore, the United States should also be looking at how environmental regulations are evolving in the different regions. In order to show you that and to explain a little bit about that, I am looking here on the left at the sales and purchase agreements which have been signed by all the projects which are currently either existing or under construction, and they are classified by the type of countries or buyers which have bought all this LNG. You can see that the European region, so EU plus UK, is representing about 11% of the total LNG quantities. Other regions which are also particularly important, Japan and Korea, because they are also interested in getting a better understanding in terms of the carbon footprint of their LNG, represent another 9%. China and other regions represent together about 14%. So together, the EU, as well as Japan and Korea, which have some interest in methane emission reduction, represent only 20% of global US LNG SPAs. However, this is you should also look at the importance of portfolio players, because portfolio players, well, they might decide to sell in pretty much any market. And in particular, the European market is quite attractive because it's a liquid market, and also there is third-party access to the LNG import terminals. These portfolio players are either international energy companies, they can be also Asian players or European players. And when we look at what happened in 2023, we can see that, in fact, the European market was particularly important for US LNG exports, given that it was representing about 2/3 of US LNG exports in 2023. Now, of course, when I am looking at what the United States players and the LNG players are doing in terms of adjusting to these new requirements in terms of lowering the LNG supply carbon intensity. So when you are a US player, and this bar chart here is a little bit of a schematic of the LNG carbon intensity. It's not at scale, and my colleague Bob is actually going to undo that completely during his presentation. But what is really important for a US player, and also from the Department of Energy perspective, is the emissions coming from first the upstream midstream, and also the emissions which are attached to the liquefaction, because most of the US LNG is actually taken by the off-takers at the exit of the LNG liquefaction terminal. So when you are looking at the upstream midstream emissions, the key target really is to reduce the methane emissions. And this is why we have been hearing more and more about certified natural gas, which is currently estimated at about 28 billion cubic feet per day, which is roughly about 1/3 of US gas production. So that's quite substantial. I have to say that when I was digging into each project's specifics, I saw mention occasionally the sourcing of certified natural gas. Not very often, however. But when you are looking at a certain number of producers which are interested in certified natural gas, such as Chesapeake or EQT, you can see that they are marketing their certified natural gas as a potential source for US LNG exports. So that's one thing to consider. The second thing to consider is how these different US LNG exporters are trying to reduce the emission at the liquefaction stage. So what they are doing, or what we can see that they are doing on their website based on the available information, is reducing the CO2 emissions from flaring, reducing the methane emission from the leakage and flaring, but also because you are using quite a lot of energy based on natural gas when you are liquefying the natural gas, reducing the CO2 emissions from the liquefaction process, either by using more efficient gas turbine, sometimes electric drive turbines with clean electricity, of course, or the development of CCUS. So we can see that US LNG players have not remained idle at all. And I'm now going to leave the floor to my colleague Tim, who is now going to focus on what the Europeans have been doing in terms of regulation. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. I hope you can hear me, and I hope you can see the slide that I just put up. Small nod would do. Thank you, Bob. My name is Tim Boersma. I'm an adjunct research scholar with the Center on Global Energy Policy, where I used to be in a full-time capacity in a not too distant past. And I talked to you from Europe, where these rules that Anne-Sophie alluded to originated and are now close to becoming legislation. And basically, there are three things that I'd like to talk to you about. The subject matter at hand, what's the issue, and what the European Commission aims to do about it. And then secondly, a high-level overview of sort of the key pieces of this legislation that are most relevant to the discussion, as just outlined by Anne-Sophie. And then finally, some feedback, because we've interacted, of course, with officials in Brussels about these rules, to also get their context and sort of their sense of, okay, fine, what do you envision happening going forward? And we thought that some of those insights would be useful to this conversation as well, and therefore we can, at an abstract level, an aggregated level, we can share them with you without naming names. And so that's what we would like to do. So first of all, as outlined, and as I'm confident many of you on the call know, methane is very broadly acknowledged, fugitive methane, as a major contributing to global warming, and so and broadly acknowledged also as sort of the low-hanging fruit, things that one can do in the short term to substantially address the warming challenge, the emissions challenge. And so that's been outlined in the proposal as published by the European Commission in December of 21. And evidently, one of the key questions for Europe, as a very large importer of fossil fuels, and so that is not just natural gas, but also oil and coal, the European Union is also therefore a very important driver of fugitive methane emissions associated with any of these forms of either production and or transport and consumption of fuels. And so therefore, even though the Europeans don't produce a lot of fossil energy at this point, and it really maybe a worrisome small amount, it is still very paramount because it's such a big consumer into potentially addressing some of this issue. And so regulating methane emissions is not entirely new in Europe. There are bits and pieces of legislation that address some of it. For example, fugitive methane in the refining sector is addressed under the Industrial Emissions Directive, but it is the first sort of framework that sets out specific measures for the reduction of methane emissions in the energy sector, and such is new. And so the proposal essentially is a set of rules for the accurate measurement, quantification, monitoring, reporting, and verification of methane emissions in energy, and the abatement and the ways in which one anticipates that can be done in the years and decades ahead. So the final text of these rules hasn't been published, but absent linguistic checks and legal checks, we know what the law will be, and so we talk from the most recent documents that we have, and that we can safely assume it's roughly going to be the law. The rules contain detailed measures also with regard to subsectors of the energy sector that we will not talk about in this webinar, but that are nonetheless very relevant when you think about methane abatement. Think of methane emissions associated to coal mining, for example. We'll not get into this, so we will have a pretty focused view on gas trade and gas imports in particular, in light of what Anne-Sophie outlined in the first presentation. So very high level summary. The implementation of these rules is going to take time. After official publication, they'll become law, but because it's a regulation, it'll directly translate into national member state legislation. And I think at a minimum, we're going to have to wait and see how exactly this plays out and how firm these rules will be. But at a minimum, we're moving towards a world where methane emissions associated with fossil fuel production and or consumption will become more transparent than they currently are. In the years ahead, companies that produce fossil fuels in the EU will have to increasingly relay more sophisticated reports about the emissions associated with what they produce and or transports. And that's going to raise that transparency level, if you will. Evidently, considering the enormous amount of import dependency of the EU, so about 90% of its gas consumption is imported, over 90%, I think about 95% of its oil consumption imported, also 70% of its coal is imported. And because of that, it's likely that these rules will set the pace for methane for addressing methane emissions across the global oil and gas sector. How do you do that as a European legislator? It's important, I think, to understand that the onus will be on importers. And so the European rules are not going to apply to a producer or an exporter in a country outside of the EU. But what the European Commission can ask is from importers to relay increasingly more detailed information about the emissions associated with what they're bringing to the European market, placed in the European market, as the rules names it literally. And so in the coming years, importers are going to have to relay where they purchase their gas to make it more specific to this discussion. They're going to have to relay information that is compliant with what is currently sort of one of the standards that's globally used a lot, OGMP 2.0. That refers to, for those that don't know, the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, a United Nations environmental program, reporting and mitigation program that is supported by a large amount of companies globally, over 120. That covers about 40% of global oil and gas production. And so that is the standard that will be used until the Europeans have set out their own framework, which they'll publish after publication of these rules and work on, but our expectation is chiefly be in line with what OGMP 2.0 currently refers to, and gradually be ramped up. And so that's and then from 2027 onward, worth noting that with regard to imports, there'll be a regulatory equivalency test, if you will, for new and renewed contracts, where importers again will have to relay increasingly stringent information, more detailed information about the emissions associated with what they bring to market. And said bit by bit that framework will be built out. There'll be a transparency database. Commission intends to publish a lot of the data that they gather, and so there'll be a rapid response mechanism of sorts where the Commission can engage bilaterally with countries and or regions in the world where certain emissions problems are being observed. There'll be a monitoring and checking tool with satellite data, et cetera. And so all of that will emerge and gradually, slowly but surely, increase transparency. So as you can tell, no specific mandate, and so therefore the rules at this point in time provide the European Commission with significant flexibility, and therefore also debatable how much measurable impact these rules are going to have in the short term. The role, I would say, of technology in the current rules seems modest. By that I don't mean that there's no room for companies to use technology of various kinds to measure their emissions, but not very stringently qualified at this point what is required. More details are coming, however, in the 12 months after publication. Minimum detection limits, etc., are going to be published by the European Commission, and so that will set the standard, so the baseline, I guess, of what companies can use. And then finally, I think it's likely that the European supply base will become more concentrated than it already is, because what the Commission does envision is sort of a reordering of its gas mix based on methane emissions associated with the production and transport, and that may well have an impact on the current supply mix. And so when we talked to European officials to get a sense of, okay, fine, how do you envision this going forward? How stringent do you think this is going to be? It largely depends on the quality of data, obviously. The higher the quality, the more stringent the Commission can be in future rules. But it does envision and it anticipates a reordering of the gas mix along the lines of methane emissions, as I just outlined. And so that also means that some of the current producers may not necessarily be producers or suppliers of the future, which is an interesting observation to make. But the Commission is fairly candid about that. It's important to note that it anticipates, in line with other reports and modeling work, that demand for gas overall continues to decline in the EU, as most of you will likely know. But really, principally, the Commission favors principles over prescription. So at this point in time, it doesn't feel that it has the accurate and right data to be very prescriptive in what it wants from companies and or regions that are supplying the European Union, but rather share the principles as outlined in OGMP 2.0 and similar methodologies, and would like to promote that standard amongst those parts of the world where European off-takers source their gas. It does not expect the European Commission does not expect these rules to lead to a big premium for natural gas, which is interesting because evidently some of the abatement can likely be done at a net zero cost, but other of it may not, and so those costs need to go somewhere. Maybe we can get into that later. And then finally, the European Commission will continue its dialogue with other jurisdictions, even though there's maybe you can have some debate as to how effective those efforts so far have been, considering, for example, Bob will talk about it a bit, how the US rules have shaped up so far and how they do or do not relate to what Europe is putting out. Finally, important, I think that the European Commission doesn't really want to point at specific companies or single them out, but rather look at basins and producing areas, subsectors, and sort of set a standard there and encourage those producers in those basins to do increasingly better, and by publishing the data that the importers collect. And so I think I want to leave it there and turn it over to Bob. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tim. We can now turn to Bob, who is going to answer this crucial question: how does US LNG compare to coal? Bob, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, and good day. I'm Robert Kleinberg, and a pleasure to be on this webinar. I'm the third speaker of the three, and my focus, as Anne-Sophie just said, is going to be on coal versus liquefied natural gas, with a view toward the environmental issues predominantly, with a comment on the technical rationale for the pause of DOE permitting. So these are the questions that I'm going to undertake to ask in the next 10 minutes. First, do life cycle analyses of greenhouse gas emissions support the argument that the US should stop building LNG export capacity? Secondly, how credible are those life cycle analyses? Third, will newly promulgated European Union and US methane reduction legislation and regulation meet expectations? And finally, political and commercial considerations aside, does Biden's pause of the DOE permitting process make technical sense? So here we go. These are sort of expanded versions of Anne-Sophie's bar chart, which I will destroy in a few minutes. This is the sort of latest data coming out of the environmental advocacy community. I have looked at the input parameters, and they are generally fair. So I'm using this as an example. But one thing that you see right away is that greenhouse gas emissions shown in black for the emissions from combustion of fuels, clearly liquefied natural gas and gas in general is much more desirable than the carbon dioxide emissions from coal. So that's the black bars, and it's almost a factor of 2. And in fact, the use of natural gas in the US electric power industry has been a big reason why US greenhouse gas emissions have been going down for the last several years. It's exactly because of this reason. Now, the green bars are carbon dioxide emissions not from combustion, but from the upstream provision of natural gas to the final consumer. I mean, there is some combustion in there, obviously, sort of process combustion, but not anything that benefits the customer. And it's divided into 2 parts. One is from the feed gas, which is the emissions due to production and transport of gas from wellhead to the LNG gate. The second part is the LNG process itself, along with the tanker, along with the sea transport. Now, the red bars are, again, emissions from the upstream, you might say, but this is methane, shown in red. And for coal, we have a ventilation air methane, which is difficult to get rid of. But on the LNG side, we have a much scarier amount of methane emissions due to both the feed gas and the LNG process. I've assumed a 2.6% leak rate in the feed gas, which is a very fair assumption these days. Now, one thing I'd like to note about this, and my main objection to it, is that carbon dioxide in the black and the green are put on the same scale as methane in red. Now, these are two very different gases with very different properties in the atmosphere. And in order to put them on the same scale, it's generally, these days, generally the practice to use the so-called global warming potential of 82.5. So you multiply the amount of methane going into the atmosphere, multiply it by 82.5, and you call that carbon dioxide equivalent. This is really a very wrong-headed kind of analysis. A better analysis is shown here. This is a chart with time on the horizontal axis spanning a century. Vertical axis is the incremental temperature change, the global surface average temperature, due to the activity that's being calculated here. And the activity is 1,000 terawatt hour per year electric generation industry for a plant lifetime of 50 years. So for the first 50 years on the horizontal axis, we are putting greenhouse gases into the air, and then we stop doing that. The big difference is that there's a black line for coal, and it sort of goes up for the 50 years and then levels out, more or less. And that's because carbon dioxide has an atmospheric lifetime of centuries. So once it's in the atmosphere, it stays there. On the other hand, methane, when you put it into the atmosphere, decays in a matter of a few decades. So if we look at the colored lines, the red line is combustion of natural gas to carbon dioxide, which increases until the plant shuts down and then levels out. That's just carbon dioxide. The other colors are that carbon dioxide signal plus the effect of methane leaks from 1% to 5%. Typically, as I said, global average, something like 2.5%. So between 2 and 3, the orange and green lines. Now you can see that if you look at just the first few years, it's all kind of comparable and maybe somewhat reminiscent of the chart that I just showed you. However, once the methane stops going into the atmosphere because you've shut down the power plant, the methane signal disappears. So in the long run, it doesn't count so much. So, whether you look at the short run or the long run, it makes a big difference. But it's very, very important to realize that carbon dioxide you put in the atmosphere is going to be there for a long time. Therefore, I say that what we need is not these simple bar charts, but physics-based climate models, which are generally available and widely used, but just not widely used enough, particularly in this community of people worried about greenhouse gas effect. Now, another thing we should think about is not just look at what has been happening with our industries, but what is going to happen. Because right now, as Tim said, we have a raft of new regulations and laws coming out of both Europe and the United States. And therefore, things are going to be different in the future than they are now. So the first two bars in this chart are the same as what I showed you earlier. The third one is an estimate, maybe a guess, of what the LNG impact is going to be in the future. Again, using this global warming potential methodology. Again, combustion will be the same, but in my estimation, we could see as much as a 90% reduction in methane emissions into the atmosphere. That's based on the fact that US regulations are clearly pointing toward a target of 0.2% methane emissions from natural gas and petroleum systems, which is 10% of the 2.6 that is sort of global average today. So I've discounted the red bars by 90%. I've also discounted the green bars, which is the carbon dioxide emissions from upstream processes, by about half. And that might be a little bit optimistic because there are no rules on electrification or carbon capture and sequestration, as Anne-Sophie mentioned earlier. But I think one thing that we need to educate our policymakers about is that dealing with carbon dioxide in the upstream is important, not just methane, because basically you have to add the green bar to the black bar to get the long-term effect of using these gases. So the second message is, not only do we need physics-based climate models, but we also need to account for emissions reductions mandated by EU and US law, and perhaps other countries in the future, which we need to encourage. So just to wrap up, to answer the questions, do life cycle analyses of greenhouse gas emissions support the argument that US LNG, the US should slow down building LNG export capacity? Yes, but how credible are those life cycle analyses? Well, in my opinion, the life cycle analyses based on global warming potential or CO2 equivalent are unphysical and cannot be trusted. Next, will newly promulgated EU and US methane reduction legislation and regulation meet expectations? Honestly, we don't know. These laws and regulations are brand new. They've just been promulgated, not even published yet in the case of Europe, as Tim pointed out. The goals are ambitious, but we know that EU legislation will be slow to ramp up, and US regulations are, to be honest, rife with pitfalls and inconsistencies. However, the new Measuring, Monitoring, Reporting, Verification, MMRV, International Working Group that was just announced last November is a hopeful development in terms of international coordination of understanding how much greenhouse gas we're putting into the atmosphere. Finally, political and commercial considerations aside, does Biden's pause of the DOE permitting process make technical sense? I think so. The pause, which is said to be months, not years, is technically justified and should be extended until the economic and climate consequences of expanding LNG trade are better understood, both from the standpoint of climate modeling and from the standpoint of the effect of all these new regulations on the future. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I think we're ready for discussion.
Indeed, we are. And thank you, Bob. I'm sure that if there are some Department of Energy people listening to this conversation, they must be thinking, oh, we have to go back to the drawing board and look at things completely differently than what we were doing before. So I would like to start a conversation by asking you guys two questions. First, Tim, at some point you were mentioning that these new rules in the European Union were going to impact new and renewed contracts. But it's fair to say that, well, first of all, there is only one small share of US LNG which is really contracted by European companies. A lot of the LNG from the US or from other countries, actually, which is arriving to the EU, is actually spot LNG. So how do you reconcile these kind of different definitions? Are these rules also going to impact any kind of LNG?
Well, thank you, Anne-Sophie. I think that the rules as laid out and the regulatory equivalency test that I alluded to, according to the rules, is going to apply starting in 2027. And it says new contracts, and you might say, well, there's a lot of contracts out there, so they're out of scope. Or renewed contracts, and typically what that means is that, and as you know well, fairly common practice, in every so many years, existing contracts get renewed, i.e., buyer and seller decide we want to continue with our business. But oftentimes, the conditions around which a trade is done are then sort of revised and sort of held up and say, okay, this is still pass muster, and so that would qualify also as contract renewal, contract revision, if you will. And so I think that my hypothesis would be that slowly but surely, therefore, gas that's under contract that's sold in the EU, because obviously what matters is what importers are going to relay to the competent authorities. But all of those contracts that underpin those imports in due time will slowly but surely come in scope because of the way that the rules are designed.
Thank you. And Bob, I mean, I'm sure that everybody who is looking at your presentation must be thinking, wow, okay, so 2.6% methane leakage rate, that seems to be higher than the EPA number. And on top of that, Anne-Sophie has just said that according to the assumption, there is about a third of US gas production, which is certified natural gas. So surely the certified natural gas must have a much lower methane leakage rate, maybe 0.2%. So how do we reconcile all these different data?
Right. I was really astounded when I heard that a third of US natural gas production is certified. I honestly couldn't believe it. So I interviewed the people at MIQ very, very closely to try to understand where these numbers came from. And one thing you have to understand is that the certification, at least in the MIQ version of it, is done at basin level. So they're looking at companies' practices over a basin. They're not looking at individual measurements. So there is the measurements involved, but basically, I think certification starts at levels a good deal higher than 0.2%. 0.2% would be considered excellent, and not everybody makes excellent. Another factor is that there are some basins that have intrinsically low methane emissions. Two particularly interesting ones are Eastern Pennsylvania, Northeast Pennsylvania, and Haynesville in Louisiana, where the gas that's produced is essentially dry gas. There's no oil mixed in. Almost all of the methane leakage is from mixed oil gas situations, associated gas, where you have to separate the liquid from the gas. That's where you have a lot of problems with tanks, separators, valves, and so on. So some of that gas is already 0.2%. Some of it is not quite there, but on the way, and so it gets certified.
Thank you very much. I think there was also a question that you wanted to answer, which was about the question about CBAM and from Andrew about the CBAM and versus EU methane rule. So would it be feasible or helpful to include methane along with CO2 in carbon border adjustment rules?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is based on the European trading system. I'm sorry, the emission trading system of the European Union. And basically only applies to carbon dioxide, embodied carbon dioxide in products, and a limited number of products. The reason why it has not been extended to methane, and this is explicit in some of their background materials, is that you can estimate carbon dioxide content of products pretty accurately because you know how much natural gas or coal or oil is going into the production process, And given that amount of fossil fuel, how much carbon dioxide is going to be coming out of it at your process conditions. Those are all very well known, I mean, to within a few percent. So therefore, you can trade off that embodied carbon dioxide content against the credits that are traded on the emission trading system. Methane is really hard to estimate because it's basically leakage that's accidental. No one really knows how much it is. There's multiple methods, satellites and aircraft and so on to try to estimate it. And therefore, it cannot be traded against a credit in the European trading system. So so you need a totally different set of rules, which falls under the European Union law that Tim just discussed. It's very much based on not on a quantitative analysis so much as doing all the right things to minimize the leakage. So two very different sorts of greenhouse gases cannot be treated on the same scale.
Thank you.
And I'll be
maybe a
happy
question
to
from
send Andrew the paper that I just wrote on this subject.
Absolutely. So, Andrew, you can contact Bob by email, for example. I think this is a question that I would like to ask you both. This is a question from Maria Pastukova. Do you think the EU methane regulation applying to gas export can provide an additional push to introducing a ban on routing, venting, and flaring in the United States? Maybe I give you, Tim, first the floor, and then Bob can build up on what you will say.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And so, I mean, so clearly the European rules, as part of the methods for abatement described in the European rules, are fairly stringent rules for both flaring and venting, and they'll be, I mean, so absent sort of safety situations and emergencies, etc. Essentially, those will be banned as much as possible from European domestic production, and these rules will be included, and they'll sort of set the baseline, I guess, for post 2027, when an equivalency test will be held based on the information that importers are disclosing from where they purchase their commodity. So no, I don't think. I mean, these rules are not going to transpose into legislation outside of the EU, evidently, but they are going to inform, to what extent rules elsewhere live up to that standard that the EU is now publishing in the coming months. So in that sense, it creates transparency, and but yeah. So that's where I would leave it. I don't know if Bob wants to add more.
Yeah, honestly, I don't have too much to add to what Tim said. I think that there seems to be a move toward harmonizing rules around the world, partly because the European Union has figured out a way of evading World Trade Organization anti-tariff strictures. But I think Tim covered most of the question.
Okay. I think I saw a question about Russia and Qatar somewhere, so I'm going to answer that. First of all, I mean, the imports of Russian gas from the EU are definitely decreasing. This is something that we have addressed in a recent paper that you can find on our website on the natural gas page that we have just written and published with my colleague Tatiana Mitrova. What we can see also is that, I mean, there is potentially an opportunity for the EU to get rid of gas from Russia when a lot of LNG comes to the market. And I definitely anticipate that this is going to be what is going to happen, simply because in the latest rules on hydrogen and decarbonized gas package, there was something which was said about this possibility to be given to member countries in order to get rid of Russian gas. So I do anticipate that there will be some sort of mechanism mechanism that will enable countries, once there is more gas available worldwide, to get rid of their Russian LNG and potentially Russian pipeline gas as well. In any case, the transit contract between Ukraine and Russia is going to expire at the end of 2024. So this is going to remove about half of the current pipeline gas supplies from Russia to the European Union countries. And then there will remain what is going to be supplied by Russia through Turk Stream. And eventually, as I noted in the paper, I think this is where the methane regulation from the European Union could actually move Russian gas to the undesirable stack of supply with the highest methane rate. Bob has written extensively on that because, I mean, we know that Russian gas in terms of methane is not particularly the best. So I think that would be a way also for the EU to slowly remove Russian gas if it's not done by 2027, which is actually the target. And now I see that a lot of questions are coming. Okay, so now we have also another question about Azerbaijan. I was wondering whether one of you would like also to tell us a question about Azerbaijan supplies to Europe. Tim, do you want to answer that question so that we actually answer all the question about suppliers to Europe?
Well, I'm reading. Am I reading the? I'm sorry, I'm just reading the question. But is the question whether Azeri gas is still going to find its way to Europe? Is that the?
Yes, or what is going to happen? How these rules are going to happen to impact Azerbaijan, for which most of the gas exports are going on the European Union with long-term contracts, which are going to last up until the 2040s.
Yeah. Well, so to be very okay, yeah, that's a good question, and it applies broader. I don't want to not get into the specifics of Azeri gas, but take it broader because there's lots of gas also from North and West Africa flowing into the EU under long-term contracts, and so there's no barrier to entry of this gas into the EU. But what there is what the EU does envision is sort of an ordering based on methane emissions and transparency around those data, and that over time, as demand for gas declines, it envisions a reordering, if you will, of that supply mix. So there's no formal entry barrier of gas into. It's not like there's going to be a methane police at the border who says, okay, you're not welcome here. That you cannot. So that's how that would work. And over time, I think the EU is fairly candid. The European Commission, I should say, is fairly candid about it anticipating a reordering of its supply in light of an anticipated continued and gradual decline in demand.
Now, maybe a question for Bob, which is more, first of all, on the global warming potential. So what would you say to those who are arguing that global warming potential based on 100 years is more appropriate to convert methane to CO2 equivalent? I think you have strong opinions about that. What would happen to the comparison that you have just shown if we are using this 100 years equivalent? And do you think that either the EPA methane rule or the IRA methane fee are going to cover LNG liquefaction already?
Okay. First, if you just repeat the second part of that question.
Yes. Do you think the EPA methane rules or the IRA methane fee are covering LNG liquefaction already?
Yeah. Okay. Let's start with that one. Yeah. So there's been a whole group of new rules that have just come out, as I said, in the last few months from the Environmental Protection Agency and other US federal agencies. Liquefied natural gas is interesting. It is not included in the sort of what you might call general rules on methane abatement, they're called Quad OB and Quad OC. However, it is covered by the rule governing the methane fee. So that's subpart W. And large emissions from liquefied natural gas facilities are counted. And if you exceed the rather modest limits provided in the law, the fee is draconian. It's something like in the next few years, it'll ramp up to $1,600 per ton of methane emitted. So this is something that is going to be of great concern to the liquefied natural gas producers who are building, gigantic facilities and certainly do not want to exceed the allotment that they're given to avoid the fee. So going back to global warming potential, 20 years or 100 years, they're both wrong. And I think using either one of them is deceptive. I worked with a colleague, Drew Pomerantz, on a much more sensible method based on general economic principles like net present value, which is far superior. But really, I think because these two greenhouse gases, methane and carbon dioxide, behave so differently in the atmosphere, you really should calculate the actual temperature changes that result from the emission of one or the other or both in combination. That's the only way to really understand what's happening. So I'm a physicist. I believe in precise numbers and data. I just would not settle for global warming potential, be it no matter what the time scale, because they're all wrong.
Thank you. At least this is very clear. Now we have a few questions also about satellites and how satellite can actually help in terms of measurement and also can assist policymakers in better understanding or better understanding what the methane emissions from the different potential suppliers or existing suppliers of Europe are. Would either one of you want to answer that question?
You can take that. The thing that's difficult about the European Union control of greenhouse gases is that they are a buyer, and so they need to understand how much methane or carbon dioxide is embodied in the products that they import. Now, it's difficult to send your inspectors, your European Union inspectors, into Algeria, Russia, whatever country you want. They're probably not going to get a lot of cooperation from the local authorities. So, and moreover, aircraft, which is widely used in the United States and Canada, also doesn't work in those countries for the same reason. So in the new methane law that the EU has promulgated, they specify satellites as a way of checking up on the reports that they're getting from the exporters. That makes sense. Satellites can go anywhere. There's no limit on what they can take pictures of. And there are very, very good means of satellite detection of greenhouse gases these days, getting better and better all the time. And in fact, soon, I can't tell you exactly when, the Environmental Defense Fund will be launching its new methane detection satellite, which will have really interesting new capabilities. So satellites, yes, are going to be a very big part of the picture in the future.
And just to
As I think
briefly
a
add,
few years ago. Sorry,
yeah,
Steve, continue.
No. I apologize. I was just gonna add that and just in terms of time, in terms of planning, this monitoring tool that Bob alluded to, using satellite data is supposed to be operational 2 years after publication of the legislation. So that gives you a sense of when this will all start to unfold.
Absolutely. No, I was just going to say that, with the satellite, at least there is no way to hide. And this is something that we wrote a few years ago on CJEP's website. There is also a question about, the methane reporting rules and how they could be harmonized and what could harmonization could look like. And also how the EU could become a much more discerning consumer and how, that could actually impact how some countries, which are historically not particularly very good at venting and flaring, could change their behavior. Maybe I give you the floor first, Tim, and then if Bob wants to add something from the US perspective.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. So I think the concept that you're describing is essentially what the European Commission envisions with these rules, right? It aims to sort of promote a standard, if you will, and encourage those regions in the world that want to supply the EU to adhere to these standards and I guess ideally go above them and beyond. Harmonization in no small part through transparency and publication of data. The MRV rules, so the measuring, reporting, and verification, measuring and reporting based on existing standards first, and then a template that the European Commission is going to publish later, and existing templates like GeoGMP 2.0. And European interpretation thereof, but it won't be far off, would be my sense, coming in the 12 months after. Verifiers, of course, accredited through official channels, so not your mom and pop shop that's going to verify the data, but officially accredited verification, and then it's going to take about 12 months to get LDAR rules more specifically designed with detection technologies, etc. The European Commission already in the rules gives fairly detailed information about what it envisions here. So every little piece of the supply chain, it has detection limits and minimum detection limits, I should say, but also detection frequencies that it anticipates going forward from producers. So that gives you a sense of what they're looking for, and more details thereabouts are going to be published in the years ahead.
Thank you. And maybe one last question to finish. Yeah. I was going to give Bob one last question to finish. What are the most effective ways and technologies to reducing methane emission? Actually, since we're talking about that, that should be the main theme.
It's because the methane emissions have such varied sources. I mean, with carbon dioxide, it's mostly what comes out of smokestacks. And that's a relatively easy problem. But methane emissions come from all kinds of places. There's the class of emitters that are very tiny but extremely numerous, tens of millions of valves and so on, versus the one gigantic blowout in Turkmenistan. So it's very, so one size does not fit all here. Okay. And I'm not sure I answered your question fully, but you can remind me of what the first part was.
No, the first part was, in fact, how effectively reduce methane emissions.
Yeah. So it's a variety of methods depending on what sort of emitters you're looking at. So, for example, in the new Environmental Protection Agency regulations, they are banning a certain class of valves, each of which emits a small amount of methane, but there's millions of them. So there's just a blanket prohibition from using that kind of valve, and that will make a huge difference. But on the other hand, that does not help in controlling your well blowouts. So you need a different method for that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think that will be our last question answered live. Do not hesitate to reach out to us. I know that I have left a couple of questions unanswered, but we will be very happy to answer them by email. So thank you very much to both Bob and Tim for joining us today. And thank you also to our audience for joining us. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available soon on the Center on Global Energy Policy website in a few days. Our next event, which is Climate Justice Series, Resource Extraction and Energy Equity, will be held on Friday, the 1st of March, from 10 to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for a full calendar of upcoming events, you can visit our website. We definitely hope you enjoy the rest of the day and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie.